rights. First, we have David Shuckman, a former science editor of the BBC, who really helped create and shape the field of environmental journalism as we know it. And he continues to work as a prolific writer and speaker on these topics. Welcome, David. And we also have with us, thank you, so happy to have you joining from the UK. And we also have with us Malgorzata Buszko-Briggs, who is a senior forestry officer and team leader of the Forestry Division at FAO, who comes from 20 years working in the environmental sector, and her career spans across the globe. So she really knows so much about what's happening in different parts of the world. So thank you both for joining. So happy to have this conversation cap off this seminar. I just want to make sure that Margo is on screen. I'm not seeing her on my screen, so I want to make sure that she is here with us. Just a sec. She's rejoining, so I think she had a bit of technical difficulties, and I'll wait to start the conversation until she gets back. In the meantime, welcome, David. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
There we go. There's Margo.
I just saw her for a second. Hi, Margo.
Hi, I'm sorry. I was kicked out as soon as I was about to open my mouse. This is the crash, but I'm back. So hi, everybody. No. Hello, David, and welcome.
Hi.
Welcome. So I just introduced you, but once again, welcome to this conversation. So happy to have you both here in dialogue. And it's the last session of the day, so let's just jump right in. David, you have been reporting and editing stories on forests for decades. How have you seen narratives on forests change in the media over time? And what are some of the prevailing narratives around forests that you see communicated today?
So that's a great question, and it's great to be taking part in this. I think we've seen narratives change. There are fashions in the news. Some issues rise and then fade away. I mean, when I was kind of a young man, the big concern about the rainforests was the fate of indigenous people living inside them. Then there was a great mounting concern about the loss of carbon storage as the forests were chopped down in the context of climate change. And I think perhaps more recently, there's been growing concern about the potential loss of biodiversity with continued deforestation. And I think right now, we're seeing all three of those different narrative threads coming together as people start to realize how each of them affects the other, and you can't really solve the problem without addressing all three in one go, which in a way is a positive thing, because there's more reason than ever for the media to engage with the forestry story, but it does make it a bit more complicated. And I think we'll perhaps come on to why that might be so later in the conversation.
Thanks, David. So again, a move from a lens on Indigenous peoples, then to the loss of carbon, and recently that loss of biodiversity. And I think it's really important what you're saying about making these links between things that we often view as separate, but really looking at the interconnections of how one cannot survive without the other, So hopefully maybe the next narrative will be on that and bringing different topics into a more holistic perspective. Margo, how does what David has just said resonate with you? And what from your scientific organizational point of view is still missing from current media on forests that you would like to see brought into the limelight more?
Thanks very much. Now, this resonates really, really well. And I think David got really a great point, on this interconnection, which also brings a certain element of complexity, I think. When I started my career, my professional career, we were kind of, always concerned, about the image of forester. And I mean, in the past, this image of forester was, always, somehow associated with a chainsaw, with cutting trees, which was considered bad. But I mean, is it really bad? If you do it sustainably, it can provide, a lot of responses, to current challenges, especially when we're talking about this interconnected, complex, set of challenges and the responses we need to look for. And I think, foresters nowadays, they look through the lenses of ecosystem services, the services that forests provide to store carbon, to respond to climate change through the nature-based solutions or forest-based solutions, if you wish to say, to ecotourism, and they probably plant more trees than they cut through all the restoration activities that are going on. I think, perhaps one comment I'd like to share is really to talk a little bit about the strong sides, and I think that this narrative on climate change and overall climate science, the climate talks, the IPCC reports, those are covered really greatly. I think this is really present in media, probably with such an intensity since maybe, I don't know, Paris Agreement 2015. You all remember, the talks in Copenhagen the year before. It was really difficult to bring everything and everybody and the mindset on a very positive, kind of more action-oriented and the sense of urgency for climate action, into a public debate. But I think it's been done and it's great. And I think forest as this nature-based solution somehow appear in this narrative, but not so much on the practical implementation, on what it really means, this nature-based solutions. What is it that the forestry can offer? So I think there are some sides that we can maybe do a little bit more about. Now, I think forestry can also offer a lot of technical various solutions. There is a myriad of different things which I could talk probably for hours. I'll stop here because this can go probably way too much. But I think also one more, maybe my final point, is the narrative about deforestation and halting deforestation. I think we have no time to lose. We need to really do a lot more. And then this brings me again to the action on the ground and how we can really, focus the narrative on that, even more than it is now. Thank you.
If I may add to that, I mean, I do think it's very, very easy perhaps to be caught up in a lot of discussion about solutions, which does distract from the unbelievable scale of tropical deforestation. I mean, I've seen for myself, particularly in the Amazon rainforest, I've been to the same area of the Amazon 3 times running over a space of nearly 20 years. And it's just heartbreaking to see the scale of what's happened, how what was a rich, vibrant, active, noisy rainforest with all that's wonderful about that, just hacked down and cleared away for really pretty sterile, monotonous, monoculture agriculture, agribusiness on a vast scale, industrial scale. And, those fields are pretty quiet, apart from the mooing of a few cattle, I mean, or a tractor spraying fertilizer on a field of soy. I mean, it's a really dramatic change. And I know there are various ways in which we in the media have been trying to convey the scale of that. And I think, devices like using satellite pictures from Google Earth and to see the transformation. But I think there's no substitute for sort of being on the ground and seeing the before and after. And particularly what always strikes me is the absence of birdsong. When you go from a live, rich, intact, virgin forest to one of these bare landscapes and just how quiet it is, how silent, and that's creepy. But I think it's important that we don't lose sight of that narrative, that whole bit of storytelling, while it's so important to look at solutions.
Thank you, David. It's great that you both have brought attention to deforestation already, because that was the big topic of our last roundtable. And I think what's so important that you just conveyed, which is important for the journalists here with us today, is sharing that to average readers in a way that breaks their heart as much as what you just said is heartbreaking to me right now. And that's such a core power of the media, and balancing that with narratives about how using forests in things like a bioeconomy, how some ways that we still have to cut down trees can exist together. And we can use forests to help build a better future, but also end deforestation. I think it's very powerful to have these narratives together. David, I'm going to go back to you on a question that kind of gets at the basis, the foundation of journalism, which is language. And often in the forestry sector, language gets quite complex, whether it's vocabularies or big long acronyms or even short acronyms, which is very important to the sector. It's important to have this rich lexicon. But when media and journalists are trying to report on things to a person who just knows a forest as a group of trees, how can the journalist play a role in bridging this gap between the language of the scientists and the language of an average person?
So I think every community has its own language. I mean, if you stepped into a newsroom and were not a broadcast journalist, you'd be struggling to understand what everybody was talking about. And certainly this whole forestry sector has developed its own vocabulary, which makes no sense at all to most of the rest of the planet. I actually have trouble with the phrase nature-based solutions in my reporting, because people often say it quite rapidly. And I've become aware of people in the audience go, well, hang on, what did that person say? Nature-based, so what is that? And then you get to REDD+ and a whole lot of other stuff about carbon fluxes, and most people will tune out. And in an age when we're all scrolling on social media, you don't want people to scroll away from your story. So you want to stay focused. So I think, in my own experience, it's about engaging with scientists and sometimes together working on, through discussion, working on ways to describe the science. And a couple of memorable events for me. One in Borneo, we were doing a story about palm oil plantations, clearing away old forest. And I was interviewing an expert, and he was getting quite lost in a lot of terminology about carbon pricing mechanisms and stuff. And I just kept pressing him. And he came out with a phrase which may be a cliche in your circles, I don't know, but it's, we have to find a way of making the trees be worth more alive than dead. And I just stopped in my tracks. My cameraman, I could hear, took a deep breath. That's the phrase that works. How do you make the trees more valuable alive than dead? And another experience was actually in the Amazon with an amazing scientist who's Brazilian but based at the University of Oxford. And again, we were, she's deeply into the carbon mechanisms and the counting, and we were talking about all of that, which is fascinating, but I kept sort of reaching for a phrase that would really resonate. And she said, look, I love the trees. And I kind of, okay, I love the trees. And I realized early in my career that the trees do not have a voice. Okay. And then she said, and I dedicate my career to giving the trees a voice. And there wasn't a dry eye in our team. I mean, my producer, me, the cameraman had just been covering the conflict in Afghanistan. He was a tough cookie. He had a tear in his eye at that phrase. I'm giving the trees a voice. So powerful. And, when we ran the story, the feedback was amazing. And in the newsroom, everybody loved it. I think it's about encouraging scientists to think through how to portray their developments, their research to a wider audience, and above all, to remember that they're human beings. And for the journalists to do everything they can through a trusting relationship to encourage that. And I think that's the way to try to cut through and bridge that divide.
Thank you, David. That's quite emotional, and portraying that to people through the work of journalism is so crucial for change. It is, that in itself is a change agent. Before we go to our next question, I forgot to mention something at the beginning of this conversation, so I'll pause and do that right now, which is that this is an open session. So we have listeners from Twitter, from Facebook, joining us from around the world. And I encourage you, however you're watching, there should be a chat box. If you have questions for either of our speakers, please drop those questions into the chat, and we'll field those questions in a live Q&A at the end of this session. So thanks, and back to the discussion. Margo, from an organizational standpoint, what are some of the biggest challenges that you see for engaging with journalists from your side of the equation?
Thanks very much. I really, really like what David said. This is really great advice already, to simplify this, and maybe, through the relationship and building trust and working jointly, on how to really find this narrative. That's actually a great idea, a great way forward. I mean, from the expert point of view, I think one of the biggest challenges is really how to simplify this information. We often talk complicated, complex concepts. We use a lot of abbreviations. You've mentioned already RED+. My goodness, I've been trying to explain this to my family, what it is. I had a lot of challenges, to be very honest. We probably also don't have that clear, ideas. What is the aim that we want to really, what's our key message that we want to communicate? Perhaps, if you wish to say, sometimes maybe we don't even have, skills on how to simplify, the information that would be, sort of understandable in everyday language. I think we do have a lot of technical information, and sometimes, if we need to simplify it, for technical experts, it can be almost painful to simplify this a very simple message. So that's a little tricky issue here, and we also, sort of scared and aware, that, the knowledge should not get diluted somehow, in kind of a too simple messages, and too kind of superficial. There's one issue I wanted also to raise, which I think, David, you've mentioned too, on the language. The type of the language issue, we often talk in terms of probabilities, and potential unknowns, and how to communicate these probabilities and potential unknowns, so that don't get, as a message, some kind of a suspicious message, or a message that, potentially could be considered, or misunderstood as an attempt to cover up something. We often talking about, ranges of values, for example, the potential of RED+, to the mitigation potential of RED+. It's very hard to give one key figure. Of course, it depends who you ask. Also in the science landscape, you get different figures, but normally we talk ranges. Also the IPCC report talk about ranges, and that's an additional challenge. I think sometimes we also maybe don't have news. We are not so news oriented. We think we have a story, but that's maybe not newsworthy. We still think that we do have a good story to share, but we don't necessarily want to be a news subject. I think from the institutional perspective, from the organization that I represent, for us, it's really important, that the data, the statistics, are really checked, that they are accurate, and that, the stories are based on reliable sources. So I think those are maybe some of the key points I'd like to chip in.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about that from that perspective. I mean, I think on language, I think there's the acronym problem. That's one kind of category of potential difficulty, as it were. But there's another one, which is words that mean something very particular in the scientific world, but have a different meaning to the rest of the planet. I mean, you touched on this, the range of values. I mean, the other phrase is, margins of error. And I think when a scientist uses a phrase like, well, these are the margins of error, I suspect a lot of people only hear the word error and would kind of think, well, have they got it wrong, these researchers? Do they not know what they're talking about? And the other one that goes with that is uncertainty. I mean, uncertainty means something in a scientific context, but to most people, it means you're not sure, or you don't really know, or you're kind of making it up. And I think that's where I always urge scientists to be really careful about thinking who they're talking to. What is their audience at that particular moment? And if it's mass media, maybe think about avoiding phrases like that. I mean, find other forms of words that don't create those potential sort of trip hazards. I mean, like working in a forest and stumbling over a root, it's avoidable. And I think just certain words can just be trip hazards. and maybe worth thinking about.
Thank you, David. I think two of the phrases that you mentioned, uncertainty and margin of error, that is something that needs to be tread carefully around because it can lead to things like public distrust in science if we're not careful. But yes, building those relationships, working across both sides to report stories that are not oversimplified, but also accessible for an average reader is so important. So David,
actually,
I have a question.
Can I just jump in on that? Because actually it's a really key point. And I mean, as a science journalist, I'm never advocating that there's dumbing down. I think simplifying is possible and is different. I mean, I think definitely we want to portray accurately whatever the science is saying. But I think with almost every branch of science, there's a way of finding a form of words that helps convey what's being talked about. Sorry to jump in there, but
no, not at all. That's what this conversation is about. Okay. But something that I wanted to know from you, which is hopefully helpful to the journalists listening today, is it's also about journalists building relationships with scientists and earning their trust so that scientists will come to them with their stories and trust that they'll be reported accurately and truthfully. So over the course of your career, did you have any challenges in this regard? And if so, how did you overcome them? What advice would you give to some of the listeners here?
Well, that's really interesting. I've generally worked on the basis that I'd like to, if I'm doing a story, I'd actually like to be able to follow it up at some future date, which means working in a way that does build trust so that I'm asked back, so that when I get in touch again with that scientist or that team of scientists, they won't say, well, actually, he really messed up last time, so we won't have him back. I mean, I think that goes to the heart of all of this. It's about being as accurate and as clear as possible, building a relationship. And I've really found it satisfying over long periods of time to build up relationships. And it can work in different ways. It might be times when there isn't really a story that directly involves a particular scientist, but I trust them and I trust their judgment. And I'll have a question about something on background. I'll just ring up and say, what do you think of this? Doesn't directly lead anywhere, but I value their opinion on it. They might ring me to say, look, we've got this. What do you think about it? How might we play it? We don't think it works for you, but how might we? And I think that's very productive. I think it's at the same time really important to realize that these worlds, science and media, are different. I mean, in the media, we think of stories. Is it a story? There may be a story which will be horribly uncomfortable if there's a scandal about missing money, if there's a scandal about, I mean, who knows what, some kind of abusive relationships in a team, if there's a scandal about, I mean, which does happen, let's be open about this, does have a scandal about data being falsified. I'm not saying in forestry, but broadly in the world of science. I mean, so those are stories for the world of journalism, which scientists will not want covered. So that has to happen sometimes. But I think what really matters is taking for the scientists to identify journalists who are interested, and if they're interested, be responsive. And because there probably aren't actually that many journalists who are interested in forests. It's most journalists are doing all kinds of other stuff. There's politics and war and crime and celebrity stuff, what a whole lot of other stuff going on. The actual number of journalists who are really interested is probably quite small. So a little bit like with saplings that you might plant in a reforestation project, nurture them. All right. And that means responding when they get in touch. It means helping them, send them papers, guide them, be very open to having discussions about how to explain stuff. And I think that's a way forward that could be helpful. And because the worst thing as a journalist is you get interested in something and people don't respond, or they take ages and they don't really take you seriously. And you kind of think, well, how much time and effort do I put into this as opposed to chasing another story? And I think if someone expresses an interest in your field, latch onto them, help them, work together, and that's only going to be productive.
Thanks for yeah.
If I may, Gabrielle, this is excellent point. That's exactly what I wanted also to say. I think this, this establishing the relationship, and I think building trust, and picking up, the opportunity when there is an interest, that would be great. But David, you said, if I may also ask one question, you said that there are just not so many journalists that are interested in forest issues, of forestry as such. What could we do even better to change that?
I don't think there's one simple thing. I mean, I think you touched on it, that there isn't often news. I mean, and it's difficult. It's the same with climate change. I mean, climate, we're talking about a buildup of greenhouse gases over centuries, over decades, the Earth system responding. It's not like we're all going to drown tomorrow or fry on Tuesday kind of thing. I mean, we're talking about relatively slow processes here, which means that there isn't like news every day. And so I think it's about working out which new pieces of research kind of shift the dial or potentially change a perspective or break new ground in some way or offer a surprise. And I think that's what to identify. And then if you know that there's a big paper coming in a couple of months that potentially does introduce a new angle or a new way of thinking or some really startling results about something, then start to think about, well, who might be interested in that? Identify who would be the best people to talk about it. Often it's not always the head of the research team. They may not be the best person. If you've got I've had experiences where the PI in the jargon, the chief scientist on a project, may be the best person to give the lecture about it, or maybe some high-level discussions, but they might not be the best person for a quick and dirty interview on social media, where you're trying to reach younger audiences. There may be a brilliant postdoc. I've definitely had experiences of that, where in a team, actually it's the junior who just finds the words and the energy and the passion and the ways of explaining things, comes up with the phrases that I find resonate, that are emotionally moving. And so I think the more you can think ahead in that sort of way, the more it's going to help you. It may be that the day your story lands, everybody's busy with something else and it all falls flat, or you find that actually you get quite a bit of pickup, and it's often unpredictable. But I think trying to identify what's sort of new, actually, what people are going to talk about. And I mean, I always think this about, every year, often more than once a year, there are new stats, aren't there, about deforestation in the Amazon, right? Different institutes produce them or whatever. And it used to be an area the size of Belgium was chopped down, or Wales, and that was the kind of standard metric. When I last went to the Amazon, we were reaching for a new metric, and we came up with, and we checked this with a lot of scientists, it was a football pitch every minute. But actually, a few weeks after we filed that report, it was a football pitch every 30 seconds. So actually we were outdated quite quickly in the pace of, but it's about trying to find those sorts of images that connect.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So really looking for those voices, those sources that may not be the most obvious ones, but can still be dynamic and help to reach new audiences. Also working far in advance with something that has potential, and seeing how you can maximize that potential by giving yourself a lot of lead time. I think those are two really key nuggets of advice in what you just said, among many others. I know we don't have too much longer before we want to get to audience questions. And my next question, perhaps you both can speak to for the sake of time, but I think it's important to cover before we move to questions. But in the context of forests, what are some of the changes that we most need, whether that's to policy, to public opinion, to reaching the private sector or finance, and how can the news media best support helping some of these changes come to life? So Margo, perhaps you would like to speak to this first, and then we can move to David.
Thanks, Gabrielle. One issue that David has already touched upon was obviously in the context of deforestation, was the agriculture driving deforestation. And I think we need to unpack, how agriculture drives deforestation. And this is exactly, the example of, the simplification that maybe we need to, go into another level of granularity in that story to build that story. We know, and you all may know here online, that the key driver responsible for 90% of the global deforestation is agriculture because of the competition of for land. But in principle, there are all kinds of other, elements and indirect drivers that are equally responsible or responsible, indirectly, for the situation that we have. That we need to feed the growing population, that we have such a huge demand for specific, agriculture commodities, a certain, trade practices. Also that the dietary preferences changing in different continents and different parts of the world, or, food loss and waste. I mean, we're losing and we're wasting 33% of food that we produce. It's, my God, it's 1/3. It's a lot, so overall, moving to basically, the consumer's behavior, the consumer's awareness. There is also this concept of imported deforestation that is now being discussed in some countries. There are some legislative initiatives that are being discussed, on how to tackle some of these issues. And then overall, there is issue of poverty, obviously. So, how do we really, unpack, this whole story and look more into the data, into the different complex drivers and make a story so that it's understandable? I think that would be something what I would bring as one issue. Two more points to highlight, and I'll try to be brief. I think the role of forest in post-COVID recovery. When we were in the lockdown for the last 2 years, everybody in the home office, was sitting and, was really so kind of, passionate about, the opportunity for building back better. But I feel that we have lost the better somewhere on the way. Because, of course, we have all kind of challenges, the economic slowdown, and different other, important drivers that push the world, to fast recovery. But I think, this green recovery, the role of forest in this and the better is somehow not there. It's not in the priority. It's not in the headlines. But I think, we have a lot to say on this issue. Deforestation, I think I have already mentioned. The role of agriculture. I think one maybe more element on the role of agriculture and the agriculture, forestry, deforestation is also the what some, I think, previous speakers have said. I think Robert has mentioned in the previous session was really about reforming the agriculture subsidies. A lot of the subsidies, and this is a huge amount of money. I don't want to quote any figures here, but a lot goes there. And there are some authors who say that most of the subsidies actually do harm environment. And I think that this is something that story is also not very much in the media. And finally, the value of standing forest. I think, David, you've mentioned this trio example, I think, from Brazil, hands-on. But the value of standing forest, it's really not reflected in policies, investments, prices. And that's another story that I think we could really, go in depth and discuss. I think I'll stop here just with this couple of headlines. Over to you.
No, really interesting. I think we are in an age of greater transparency now. Whether it's the ability of satellites to track where deforestation is happening down to a really, really local level. So, when companies or governments or individuals say that they're committed to halting deforestation, we can actually see can't we? And map deforestation. And know who's doing it. And I think that starts to shifting. There's been some amazing work by different NGOs really drilling down into land ownership, the production of agricultural products, their shipment to markets. So thanks to them, we have a much better understanding of the linkage between deforestation and consumption. And I think a prime example of that is the Greenpeace campaign targeting Nestle over the use of palm oil from Borneo and destroying the habitat of the orangutan. That resonated with consumers. And I think that's an example of where greater transparency, greater scrutiny really pays dividends, actually. And I sense that people are much more, in a public sense, consumers more aware of their choices actually not just happening in a kind of abstract way, but actually having a direct linkage back to somewhere like the Amazon. I mean, that happened with McDonald's and chicken McNuggets, the chickens being fed on soya from the Amazon. I mean, you know, so I think that's in a sense a positive development. And certainly in the media, it's a story that's kind of attractive, because often if there's something going on in a distant country, editors say, well, do our audiences really care? Well, if you can say, well, actually what you're eating, what you're choosing to eat does have a connection, suddenly I think people start to care a bit more. And I think we're only going to see more of this. Companies and anyone involved in this trade are going to have their activities progressively more intensively scrutinized. And I think if they think they can get away with greenwashing and little loopholes, oh, we didn't realize that particular bit of land, oh yeah, you see this all the time. And I think the age of transparency will, I hope, lead to an age of sincerity, and where there's genuine openness and honesty about what's happening in that industry and its impact on the forests.
Thank you so much, David. So to quickly recap some of the things that you both said, to keep them at the forefront of our listeners' minds. So we have the role of forests in post-COVID recovery. That's a needed story that needs to be reported more upon, along with agriculture and reforming some of these agricultural subsidies that are quite harmful, and putting more emphasis on the value of standing forests. That came from Margo, and from David's perspective, really hunkering down on what the media can do for transparency and shedding light on some of the bad practices that are out there in the world. So thank you so much for giving that very concrete information to our listeners. We are coming up on time, but we had 2 audience questions that I would like to get to before we move into the closing of this seminar. So hopefully all the listeners don't mind sticking around for about 5 extra minutes. And I will ask you, unfortunately, to keep your answers to these audience questions a bit short. But a listener streaming on Facebook, Guba, is asking, how do we involve locals and Indigenous peoples more in reportage, allowing them to give us the real issues on what's happening in forests? Would either of you like to comment on this?
Sure. I mean, I just think that's critically important. I love the phrase that Indigenous people are guardians of the forest, living sustainably within them. We spent a few days with the Uru-Ewawa people in the Western Amazon a few years ago, and it was fascinating to hear their perspective and their story and the challenges that they face. I would say they were wary of us, and we were kind of nervous about being too demanding of them. But actually, I think we broke some ice, we built a relationship, and I hope it was productive for them, as it certainly was for us. But no, absolutely critical. It goes back to my first point that if Indigenous rights are not addressed and really safeguarded, all the other concerns we have about forests just aren't going to be delivered. And I think the more they're seen as central to that whole story, the better. That was nice and brief, wasn't it?
Yes, thank you, David. Margo, any few words from your end before we move to the final question?
I totally agree. I mean, we've also been working, at the country level, and the organization such as FIO has a lot of programs where we do work with indigenous groups, indigenous peoples, and there are many flagship programs such as Forest and Farm Facility in FIO, or the work of the UN RED program with indigenous groups on RED Plus and beyond. I totally agree. There are stories, and this is really one of the principles. And we're really happy also to see that there was a great pledge, in Glasgow for the indigenous peoples as guardians of forest. After all, they guard a substantive amount of tropical forests. I just wanted to make one more comment on the transparency, which David said. I totally agree. I think the fact that we have technologies that actually can give us access to data in real time, this is really fantastic. And I also want to say and use this opportunity that FIO has also programs that work, with real-time monitoring. The project with the CIPAL platform, where you can learn a lot more about during the World Forestry Congress next week, is there. Supports transparency on data and monitoring for all purposes. Deforestation, restoration, the restoration framework on monitoring of restoration will be launched next week. So stay tuned, because there are some interesting news coming up next week related exactly to transparency. Thanks.
Thanks, Margo. Thanks so much about making those links back to the Congress again, and some of what is going to be addressed there. And then our final question, which I think is very practical for everyone listening, and this is for you, David. This is coming from our writer, Lily Hess in Taiwan. Do you have any advice for environmental journalists on creating stories that will catch the attention of audiences who do not usually read environmental news?
That's a really good question, and thank you, Lily. I would, for a start, not use the word environmental. It's like with so many science stories, don't use the word science. Just avoid language that might put some people off. I think an awful lot of people are really interested in environmental stories without realizing it. I mean, the classic example is plastic pollution. Everybody can engage with the sight of a beach strewn with plastic waste, or a river blocked with the stuff, or a marine creature kind of strangled by plastic. You can do environmental stories without using words that might be a deterrent. And when it comes to forests, I think it's about finding angles that your friends or former school friends will find interesting. Maybe if they're not journalists, they're not environmental, they've gone into other walks of life. When they ask you, what are you up to? You say, oh, I wrote a story about such and such, right? What's going to engage them? And I think often it's quite simple things. There were terrible forest fires. Well, every year there are forest fires in California. But what really went round the world was a story about, was it the largest or the oldest redwood threatened by fire, and the rangers trying to protect it with fire blankets? Huge story, right? One tree, right? Often something huge, like an entire landscape on fire. Everybody's sort of seen that, right? But like the biggest, the oldest tree, that connects, that cuts through. And it's a little bit like glaciers all over the world are in trouble. But where's that one? Is it in Switzerland or in France, where they've tried to cover it in blankets so it doesn't melt in the summer? I mean, that again, that's kind of, whoa, that's an environmental story, but don't talk about it in that way. I think that's the way. Just find things that just connect with people, where people go, wow. And that'll, I think, work for you. But good luck with the story, Lily.
Thank you so much, David. Really making that connection from the hard science, the hard climate science, all the way back down to the human heart. And that's how we can hopefully affect some change through the power of the media. Margo, David, it's been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to join this seminar. I'm sure that everyone listening really appreciated your time as well. It was such a rich dialogue, and we really appreciate your time. And thank you so much.
Margo and I could go on for another hour or two. Anyway, it's a
That would be great.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Good luck to everybody.